So welcome to America House. Good evening, everyone. I'm Christiane Hoffman. I'm the director here at America House. And I want to thank you all for joining us on this beautiful summer evening. As America House, our campaign this summer is Advance Your Summer. So I think it's great. I want to thank you all for coming, for choosing to come to America House this evening to do something to advance your summer and to hear from our incredibly accomplished guest speaker this evening. So Keith Richburg is a journalist and former China correspondent who spent more than 30 years overseas for the Washington Post, serving as bureau chief in Paris, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Nairobi, and Manila. He covered the invasion of Iraq, the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the U.S. military intervention in Somalia, the genocide in Rwanda, and the 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China. After retiring from the Post in 2013, he became a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University and a lecturer of international reporting at Princeton University. And today, we are delighted to have him here with us at America House for his talk, The Role of the Media in Covering Conflicts, Media Development, and Viability. So please join me in welcoming Keith Richburg.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming in. Thank you all for coming in on a beautiful Tuesday evening in the summertime, too. And I know you probably have a lot of other things to do. And I won't give a formal speech for a long time because I really want to be able to just have a conversation and get some question and answers and then get everybody home in time to watch the World Cup game tonight, which I know you're all excited about to see who wins that one. But first of all, I wanted to really thank the U.S. Embassy here in Kyiv for inviting me over here to do this. It's been really exciting for me. They have a terrific speakers program where they bring over all kinds of people, not just journalists. So I think you can get it on the Facebook page or follow them on Twitter, I'm told, and just keep and they do a lot of things here at America House too. So thanks to America House for having me here. And it's my first time actually in Ukraine. I came very close in 2004. I was on the border. I was in Hungary doing some stories about the European Union expansion. But the closest I got was on the Hungarian border of Ukraine and talked to Ukrainians who were coming over. Actually, there were ethnic Hungarians living in Ukraine who were worried that the EU border would stop them from coming over, and I did a story about that. But I always kind of had a curiosity about Ukraine. I was here for about the last week. I went off to the media forum in Donbass and then came back again. But the first few days here in Kyiv, I was able to go off and see some of the sites around here, including, and I've learned a lot. I learned, for example, about the famine of 1932-34. There's a memorial to the Holodomor. And it's very moving to go there. And one of the things that I found most interesting, one of the most shameful chapters of journalism there was the story of the New York Times correspondent named Walter Duranty, who basically wrote stories denying that this was going on. And I also learned, for me it's really fascinating, I also learned the story about some brave journalists, like the British journalist named Gareth Jones, who wrote stories at the time talking about the famine that was going on. So that was really moving for me, and it was interesting today when I woke up and started listening to BBC and read my news reports to see that there were 2 journalists just today in Myanmar who were just told they have to stand trial for something very similar, for uncovering or trying to uncover the genocide going on against the Rohingya in Myanmar. They were arrested under the Official Secrets Act. They were basically set up. And now they're being persecuted for trying to tell the truth about what's happening in Myanmar. So it just goes to show that the Great Famine was 80 some odd years ago, but now today some of the same problems are still going on. You still have journalists out there trying to uncover things that are going on and still being persecuted for it. The British journalist he died in disgrace before it came out that the stories he told were true. And so I hope those poor journalists, those 2 Reuters correspondents in Myanmar who were in jail, I hope they get out. I hope they're not sent to jail. They face up to 14 years in prison. But again, when you're covering conflicts, and I think there's some journalists here in the room. When you're talking about conflicts, it's just important to just keep going out there, keep going out, and keep trying to tell the truth as best you can. Even though you may not get a lot of recognition, you may be like Gareth Jones, like those Reuters journalists in Myanmar, you might be accused of, disseminating fake news and all that, but just don't let it get to you. You got to keep going out and pushing and telling telling the truth as best that you can. The conflict going on here, I know, is different from a lot of others because you have this sort of massive disinformation campaign that's going on out there. But that's actually true in all conflicts. We like to say in English that in conflicts, whenever there's a war, truth is the first casualty. And that really holds us true now as it did, 80 years ago. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't go out and try to cover conflicts as journalists, and that's what we need to really be doing. The media too often has been a driver or an instigator of conflict. We've seen that a lot. I've seen that in Rwanda, where it was a radio station. In French, it's called Radio of 1,000 Hills, which is the nickname of Kigali, Radio Mille Collines, that was actually encouraging people to go out and pick up machetes and pick up farm tools and go kill the Tutsi. Too often that the media is an instigator or a driver of conflict. But what I want to talk about is that there's also a flip side of that the media journalists can also, in many ways, try to help mitigate conflicts. And also be prepared. The media should be prepared in the post-conflict situation when the fighting is over to help the parties come together and to help try to advance the process of reconciliation. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, because I think that's really important. And I know you're still in the hot part of the conflict here in Ukraine, but you will at some point be in the post-conflict situation as well. So it's going to be very important how the media kind of can help advance that process a little bit. First of all, I should say, though, there are limits. I don't want to say journalists can't stop wars. Journalists can't, create peace where it doesn't exist. But on the other hand, there are some things that journalists can do to play a role in, to help mitigate conflicts or to help end conflicts. And I remember, for example, in 1994, it was actually the media coverage of the Yugoslav war, and particularly of the bombing of that marketplace in Srebrenica in Bosnia. It was the TV images of that caused the NATO allies to come in and start the first bombing campaign in Serbia. And again, later on, a few years later, it was the media coverage of the ethnic cleansing that was going on in Albania. Around Kosovo that started the second NATO intervention that helped end that war there as well. I was involved in two of these sorts of interventions where media coverage helped shine a spotlight. One was Somalia, 1992. By going in and out from Nairobi, myself and all the other journalists helped put a spotlight on what was then a man-made famine. It was a famine being orchestrated because there was no government in Somalia at the time, and these militias were actually holding up food at the ports. And by going in and out from Nairobi and reporting these stories, and thank goodness the Washington Post was putting these on the front page at the time, that prompted then President George Bush to start that U.S. military intervention that started around Thanksgiving time of 1992. And then after that, in 1994, really, I think it was the reporting of myself, AP, all the other New York Times, and others who were reporting on the genocide going on in Rwanda, that finally, after a little bit too late, but it finally did get the French to send in a military intervention, which they called Operation Turquoise, or turquoise, the color. And again, I really do think it was the fact that the media was out there and putting this stuff out that prompted people to get involved. So there is, there is a role for the media in these things. East Timor is another example. I think it was the media coverage of how the Indonesian military and their militias in East Timor were going through and ransacking the village. And I was there and saw this, and we were writing this. The Washington Post was putting these stories on the front page. And I was told later that the Clinton administration, and President Bill Clinton specifically, was looking at these stories saying, what can we do to help stop this? And the international community got together and they decided that the Australians would lead a military intervention that would keep East Timor safe after their independence referendum. And East Timor now is thriving as one of the newest countries in the world. So the media does play a big role in just basically getting out there, trying to tell these stories and getting them on the front page. But in a post-conflict situation, the media also can play an incredibly important role, and in fact, a vital role. Among other things, the media can also provide a space where opposite parties can get together. We saw this in South Africa, for example, after the end of apartheid. We saw that there were these things called, the radio and TV had these things called peace cafes, where they would bring in different parties to be able to just discuss what had happened during the apartheid era. So the media can provide a safe space for people to go and share their experiences. And suddenly you realize that people on different sides of a conflict have a lot more in common often than what separates them. Instead of inciting unrest, the media can also be involved in trying to tamp down unrest or violence when it comes along. If there's a ceasefire agreement, the media can be there to kind of monitor if there are violations of a ceasefire, if people are moving troops around. So that's a role that the media can play in a post-conflict situation. I think the most important thing the media can do, both during a conflict and afterwards, is just try to document what's going on. Because if there are going to be any kind of war crimes trials or trials for people who have violated human rights, it's going to be crucially important to know what happened at the time. And often journalists, myself included in some of these places, were the first ones there to be able to talk to witnesses, to find out what was going on, to get as much on the record as you can, to get obviously any documentation you can. That's difficult. But often it just means hearing people's stories and getting firsthand stories of people, trying to find out exactly what happened. Because when people do get prosecuted, and there are prosecutions after wars often for violations, for gross violations of human rights, these sorts of things are going to be crucial. And sometimes it's the news reports that lead the investigators to find out exactly what happened and who should be prosecuted and whether or not war crimes were committed. So it's crucially important for journalists to be out there. And I know in a place like the eastern part of Ukraine here, it's very difficult. Journalists don't have access, but there are things you can do as journalists. You can talk to refugees who are coming out. You can try to make contact with people inside, to find out what's going on. So it's difficult. It's hard work, but there are things we can do as journalists to do it. I want to talk a little bit about reporting during a conflict itself, because there are some things that you journalists in the room should know, or that everybody should know who's consuming news. I think the first responsibility of journalists covering conflict zones, and what I used to tell my reporters when I was the foreign editor in charge of about 25 reporters, the first thing you should do covering a conflict is keep yourself safe. There's no story worth dying for. There's no glory in dying to get a story. When I first started out covering this stuff at the Washington Post, an old editor once told me, he said, "Don't forget," he said, "kid, don't forget, your first job is to file your story. You can't file your story if you're dead." So I took that to heart. And I tell that to all students going out. Your first job is to get the story out. Getting yourself killed or injured, you're not going to get the story out. So first of all, you have to keep yourself safe. Among other things, that means getting some kind of training. I mean, too many people are now, too many young journalists especially, are just heading out into places like Syria or maybe even Eastern Ukraine without any kind of training in how you deal in hostile environments. And that, I took hostile environment training a bit too late. They actually gave it to us at the start of the Iraq War. They should have given it to us a decade earlier, but I think most major news organizations now are providing that kind of hostile environment training. And that teaches you things just like first aid. If you're injured, it teaches you things how to stop bleeding, but it also teaches you other things, what to do in a hostage situation, things that you should know if you're going to be in a possibly dangerous situation, how you should always let people know where you're traveling to, travel with a buddy, always travel somewhere, don't go places alone. Small things like that just really can keep you alive and keep the people around you alive. And also you need to, and in terms of just under the heading of keeping yourself safe, you need to recognize as journalists that you are also susceptible to post-traumatic stress issues the same way as soldiers are. I think there are too many journalists who come out of war situations and they've seen a lot, but they try not to tell anybody, they try not to deal with it, they're haunted by images of things they've seen. You just have to recognize it and you have to get help. There's nothing wrong with asking for help if you need it. And if you're with other journalists and you see someone is having trouble coping, just recognize that. Please come on in. There's some seats here as well. The second thing, so number one is keep yourself safe covering conflict. Number 2 point about covering conflict is I think all journalists need to recognize that the military needs to keep some things secret. Now, journalists have a pressing need to get things out in the open. We want to know everything, but I think we have to recognize that there are some issues that the military needs to keep secret. They need to keep their plans secret. They need to keep their locations secret. You need to work with the military and not against the military. You need to talk to the generals and talk to the officers and talk to the soldiers, but recognize there's some things that you might find out that they might tell you that you have to recognize as a journalist. I should not print this because this might get people in trouble. This might get people targeted. I always say, if we as journalists knew about the Allied invasion of Normandy to kick the Nazis out of France, we would not have reported that before the invasion had happened. And I think we need to kind of recognize that. Sometimes we learn things. Sometimes soldiers talk to journalists because they don't recognize that they shouldn't say things. But you as a journalist should be responsible and say, I should not say exactly where this position is, where these guys are I'm talking to. Recognize that there is a need for military secrecy. And the third area I would point to is just recognize that if you're a visual journalist, especially, you've got a camera, you've got a video camera, you've got a still camera, the visual image of conflict often can exaggerate or amplify the conflict. I always like to tell the story, I was in Afghanistan a couple times and there were these firefights going on where some Taliban militia types would come into the city and they'd be firing from a building and you'd be all kinds of excitement going on in this area, and that's where the camera would be focused. That's what they'd see on their TV screens back in the US. What they didn't show you was that 3 or 4 blocks away, people were going shopping. People were going out having dinner. I mean, it was really confined to a very small area. It wasn't the entire city, but that the camera can really focus in on something and create an exaggerated sense. So as a journalist, I think we all have kind of a responsibility to let people know the entire story going on. I'm not saying don't report things that are happening that are violent, but when there's a car bomb somewhere in Baghdad or when there's a bus bombing in Jerusalem, we have to make sure people know the entire country is not unsafe. That's a very specific area where something is happening. And it's really just a matter of providing context. So we'll make sure you always put things in context and proper perspective. I know in everywhere in the world, and especially I guess here in Ukraine, there are challenges that the media is facing, whether you're covering conflict or even just covering political unrest or covering something like the upcoming presidential campaign here. Just wanted to talk a little bit about some of those challenges here, and then we can get into a Q&A. And I'll list a couple of them here, then I'll go through them for you. I see the main challenges, and again, this is not unique to Ukraine, but I see some of the challenges as media ownership, economic difficulties or constraints, declining public trust, the fragmentation of the media, and then the ability of those in power now to bypass media by using social media and other platforms. Ownership is a big issue everywhere. And I know it's a big problem here. I've heard in the last week I've been here that there's a problem of oligarchs owning media outlets. It's billionaires owning media, owning newspapers and television is not new, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. And I'm reminded of, my newspaper, the Washington Post, was for a long time owned by the Graham family, and I think they were fantastic stewards of it. I hope you all saw that movie called The Post with Katharine Graham, played by Meryl Streep. But that paper was now bought by the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and it's been terrific. He's been putting money into the paper. They've been expanding foreign bureaus. They've opened new bureaus now. So the idea of a billionaire buying a newspaper can actually be a good thing if they're willing to just let the newspaper report independently. Just a few days ago, the Washington Post actually had a very critical story at the Amazon company in the Washington Post. That goes to show you that Jeff Bezos, even though he's the founder of Amazon, is not controlling what the Washington Post writes. Similarly, I live in Hong Kong, and the main newspaper there, the big flagship English language newspaper, is the South China Morning Post, and it was just bought by Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba. And again, so far, they've just been covering Alibaba the way they would any other organization. But he's been able to give the newspaper a new financial lease on life. They've been experimenting with new online tools and publications, new graphic designs. So it's actually been and they've moved into new offices. So having wealthy people buy media companies is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as you have owners who are going to step back and let the media still be independent. But I know media ownership here can be a bad thing, especially if media owners are going to be trying to use the publications to promote their own agenda or their own tool or their own platforms, particularly as you get near to your presidential election coming up. Economically, I mentioned that's one of the massive challenges, not just for media in conflict zones, but media everywhere in the world. I mean, the internet, as you know, has disrupted the old revenue patterns of media, everywhere. Digital revenue is now going up, but it's nowhere near replacing the advertising that used to be the financial engine for the old print newspapers. Nobody has figured out a business model yet to handle this. It's going to be a particular challenge in places like Ukraine that are new developing democracies. at the moment, I understand, like here and like elsewhere where I cover in Asia, that there's a lot of foundations that are coming in to provide financial support for media. Places like the Omidyar Foundation and others are planning are helping support some of the media. I believe the U.S. Embassy also probably helps support some media here. Long term, that's not sustainable because the donor model is not sustainable because after a while, donors want to pull their money back and they want to invest in other things and they want to see the media stand on its own 2 feet. I happen to think that's a little bit short-sighted, especially in developing democracies. Donors in the West, Western countries that donate, we donate for years to support education systems in countries. We donate for years to support the healthcare system in countries. But with media, we put in a little bit of money, and then after a while, we want the media to be on its own 2 feet. If you believe, as I do, that it's important for people to be healthy, it's important for them to be educated, but it's also important for them to be informed, then I think we should put as much attention into sustained donor support for media as we put into education and healthcare and some of the other things. That's just me talking. I can't convince others of that probably. So media is going to have to find some new revenue streams. There is some good news on the horizon. I just came back from a media conference in Singapore, and I got to meet some media companies there, some startup companies there, and I came away with the good news that nonprofit models do work. Now, it's tough and it's hard, but they do work. And I've actually got a couple of examples. There was a new one. There's a couple of examples. There's one from Switzerland. There's one from South Korea. There's one from Hong Kong, where we have our own new media outlet called the Hong Kong Free Press. And there's one from South Korea as well. The one in Switzerland is called Republik, or Republik. It started in 2017, so just a year ago. They planned a crowdfunding campaign. I don't know if you know about this. I just had to jot the numbers down here so I don't forget them exactly, because this is pretty incredible. They planned a crowdfunding campaign, and they decided they wanted to raise $750,000 in about 30 days. They got that amount in 3 hours. And they bypassed that amount. Within a couple of days, they had raised $2 million. Now, what's even more fascinating is they did this, and they had not yet published a single story. All they did is get together and say, we want to create a new news organization that's going to delve in and tell you the truth. Will you help us? They ended up raising a couple of $1 million in a couple of days. I mean, that was just absolutely incredible. They wanted, their goal was to get 3,000 people each to contribute $240 each. 3,000 people, $240 each, just to get them up to $750,000. They ended up getting 10,000 donors. Right now, and I was able to sit on a panel where this guy was speaking, and he was describing this. Right now, they have 21,000 members, and they need about 25,000, so a few thousand more, and they figure they'll be financially sustainable. They started with just 6 people, and now they can employ 40 people doing good journalism. Now, this is one model. Now, they don't call them subscribers. They actually call them members. And it's a slight difference, but they're creating what they consider a journalistic community out of this. And so these people are giving $240 each. Now, I know this is a poor country, but $240 is not a lot for a membership for a year. What they're able to do as members is they say, for example, once the journalist writes a story, it doesn't just disappear. They don't just have a comment section. They'll have a couple hours, where the journalist is online, and he'll discuss the story in a conversation with the readers. He'll talk about how he got the story. He'll take tips from the readers. So it's a real conversation. And they've started doing things like putting on special events, like in bookstores, where they talk about stories. And the other thing they do, it's interesting, is they take ideas from their members, from their readers. They'll say, what do you want us to investigate? Tell us what you want us to be doing. So it becomes really kind of a two-way or interactive model of journalism. This membership model is also being used by a paper in a place I'm familiar with in the state of Hawaii in the U.S. It's called the Honolulu Civil Beat is the name of the newspaper. They have some donor money, but they also use this membership model where they involve their members in. So again, you don't need to charge a lot if you're offering people a product that they really want. The one and by the way, they decided to do this because they said the ownership patterns in Switzerland were big corporations owned most of the media there, and they weren't delving into the types of stories that they thought were needed, some of the investigative stories. And they got some of their biggest traffic, this Republik Swiss outfit got some of their biggest traffic from outside of Switzerland when they did stories, for example, in Malaysia. There was a huge scandal involving the now former prime minister who had amassed a lot of money, and they started looking at the Swiss bank's role in that. So they ended up getting more traffic from Malaysia than they actually had from Switzerland for a while. So and often with some of these nonprofits, you see that their traffic spikes at times when they're actually breaking really interesting, in-depth stories on things. The South Korean model is one called the Korean Center for Investigative Journalism. And again, the head of that was there at this conference I just attended in Singapore. They started about 5 years ago. They went from 0 members or subscribers up to now 40,000. And now they went from about 4 or 5 paid journalists now to having, 40? They went from 4 or 5 paid journalists to now having 45 paid journalists. And again, they managed to do that by focusing on investigations and covering things that others weren't doing. The problem there in South Korea, again, was something like 80% of the media was owned by 3 or 4 big media moguls. They controlled it. So they decided that we're going to do something different. We're going to break the mold. And they found that there was a desire for that. And my favorite one is Hong Kong Free Press, only because it was started by one of our graduates from my program at the university, a guy named Tom Grundy. He started Hong Kong Free Press basically as a startup. He slept in his office. He didn't have a whole lot of money. Now they do an annual appeal, and they did one in March, February and March. It's a 2-month online appeal, and they were able to raise something like $100,000 in a very $100,000 US in a very short period of time. They have their own online site, and they also use PayPal. Those two things together have brought in quite a bit of money. And again, the average, and they do this all by donation, so it's not a subscription model per se, but they just ask you, if you like this site, please donate. The average donation is about $20 US. It's not much. But again, if you just get enough people out there, you can actually, raise a little bit of money that way. Now, again, it's not going to replace advertising. It's not going to replace donors, but it does at least give people who are reading your publication or going onto your website, it gives people a feeling that they're a part of something. It's a part of a mission. So I guess the lesson from all of these, from Republic and from the Korean Center for Investigative Journalism and from Hong Kong Free Press and from the one in Honolulu I mentioned is, first of all, you have to find a niche. You have to find an area to focus on that the other mainstream media are missing. You have to aim for quality. These things are all aiming for top quality. Like the one at the Swiss online magazine says they're going after just serious, in-depth investigative journalism. They're not trying to cover everything. They're not trying to cover all the daily news, but they're just going after the stories that they feel are being uncovered. So find a good niche, aim for quality and in-depth investigative reporting, and really you have to run it like a startup. You have to run it like a startup, and even if that means sleeping in your office. Again, some of the reporters said at some of these places they didn't get paid for the first couple of months or so because they really believed in the mission. But it just shows, the success of some of these just shows me that there is a hunger out there for good quality journalism. And I think if you say, this is a poor country, nobody's going to pay for it, I think maybe you're fooling yourselves, because just for the price that some people might just spend for one dinner a month, on a night out, they might be willing to support good quality journalism if you ask. And again, the key is asking. There's no magic solution. It's definitely hard work. Some of the other things that I mentioned here, I'll just go through briefly. Declining trust in media. I think that's a huge problem everywhere in the world, and it's especially because the media is being attacked as fake news everywhere. I think all we can do as journalists, and I still consider myself a journalist even though I'm teaching now, all we can do is try to be as truthful as we can and try to fight back with the best quality journalism as we can. Don't get lured into opinion writing as much, but just keep it fact-based, et cetera, and then we can try to restore some of that trust. The fragmentation is going to continue. I mean, that's just a feature of the internet's life. You can now go online and just sort of only read the things that you want to read. If in the States, that's particularly true. If you're left-wing, you can read only left-wing. If you're right-wing, you can read only right-wing. And that's not going to change. That's the world we live in now. So we just have to get used to it. But I think one of the one of the things that gives me a little bit of hope is, at least in times of big stories or big crises, people flock to the mainstream media again. People trust the big names. They trust a source that they know. And then, the question of the ability of those in power to go around the media by using social media tools. I mean, we can't compete with a president or a prime minister who has millions of Twitter followers. They can go, their idea is to go over the heads of the media. But I think the job of reporters in that kind of environment is simply to try to be as factual and fact-check as possible. Don't let the powers that be get away saying things to their followers on social media that we don't go through and check and say, hey, this is not accurate. That's not true. I think it's hard work, but as I said, there are some good news. There's that hunger, I believe, for truthful, accurate reporting. And I think the other thing is that the barriers to creating a new media site are lower than ever before. I mean, you don't need a lot to go online. If you know a little bit of coding or hook up with somebody who does, you can start your own website. You can start your own news site now. So the barriers to actually starting a media outlet are lower than ever before. So there is that possibility there. And, Ukraine has a good story to tell. And the other thing that I was thinking of, and I was thinking specifically of that Swedish online news magazine that actually found more readers outside of Sweden when they started investigating this Malaysian thing. I started thinking to myself, well, wow, Ukraine, there's a lot of Ukrainians in the diaspora living in Canada, United States, et cetera. They might be hungry for news about this place as well. So if you're looking for people who might just want to donate a little bit of money to keep your news organization going, that's not a bad place to look, because they maybe speak or read Ukrainian, and they might be willing to send you a check for something here or there. So crowdsourcing, looking for those other sources of revenue, et cetera. I talked a lot about the conflict, and especially the post-conflict era. I'm not naive. I've been reading here that the conflict here is still a hot conflict. You've got a ways to go before it's over. But I do see that some signs of optimism. I do see that the media can play a role, especially getting yourselves in the media. If you're a journalist here in the audience, I hope there are some journalists, getting yourself prepared, because there at some point will be a post-conflict situation. And again, the truthful reporting that you do now is going to be crucial for whether or not that post-conflict reconciliation can last, and whether there might even be some prosecutions later on down the line based on your fact-based, evidence-based reporting that you can do now. But I'm really interested in hearing from you guys and taking some of your questions and seeing if we can have a bit of a conversation. You can ask me about anything, any of the places I've been or the places I've covered. And I'll stop there. And do we need microphones around the audience? Or anybody have any questions? And we got a couple here and a couple in the front. There's one here and then.
Your headset for.
Oh, do I need the headset? Case. Okay, yeah.
No.
Oh, this one.
The Ukrainian, just in case.
This one. Okay.
Mr. Richburg, can I ask you? We are ordinary people, and we have right for mistakes. Mm-hmm. And I remember your second statement about keep secret. Mm-hmm. Can you be a little sincere? Have you ever confused some with that second statement? I mean, have you ever spread information to opposite side?
You mean during a military conflict?
Yeah.
I've not intentionally, no. I've tried never to do that. Yeah, we took at the Washington Post where I was. We tried to be very, very careful about reporting military situations, et cetera. We often reported things they didn't like, but I don't think we ever reported troop movements or where people were based, et cetera. I know there are occasions where I've actually, people have told me I could use information, but I decided not to use it because I just thought it was too sensitive and I didn't want to be in that situation as well. And often because they weren't in a position to speak. They were a lower level soldier and they weren't an officer, so maybe they told me something that they weren't supposed to tell me. So that's why I said the journalists should exercise a lot more caution sometimes to protect people from themselves. But no, I'm trying to think back if I've never deliberately revealed something or said something. I might have written something that, as I said, that anger. I know I've written things that people did not like. because I've been told that later. But I mean, fortunately, I've always been able to go back later to the military, whether it's U.S. military, British military, where I was covering in Iraq. And they might say they didn't like a story, but they've never said you shouldn't have written that or you shouldn't have revealed that. There were cases, I know, when I was the foreign editor at the Washington Post, we were involved in some cases where one of our great investigative reporters discovered that the United States had been using countries in Eastern Europe to hold prisoners who weren't being charged. These were Al-Qaeda prisoners after 9/11. We got that story. We actually went to the U.S. government and told them we had this story, and they said, we just have one request. Could you please not list the names of the countries? Because those countries may then be attacked. And so we decided that that was a fair request. So we took out the names, the specific names of the countries. So we just said an Eastern European country and a Middle Eastern country. It came out later that it was Poland and Egypt. But at the time, we decided not to print the names of those countries at the request. So we did that all the time. There was always a bit of a negotiation when we discovered something like that. That's a good question. I think there was another. Oh, sorry.
Yep. Good evening. I have two questions, separate. Okay. Yeah, if it's fine. So the first one is about during the Vietnamese War, there was this picture of the girl running, crying, burned, taken, and that when the war actually entered people's hearts, that was the face of the war.
Right.
That was a new mechanism actually used by the journalists on how to show what is going on in the world. Exactly. Now looks like all the world is in fire, and we are not impressed anymore with this kind of pictures, with this kind of videos taken by journalists in the hottest spots in the world. As a professor and as a journalist, do you know or do you consider that any other mechanism is coming or any other tool on how to talk to people about this kind of conflicts, about this kind of situations, and how to actually explain that it's important? Because it looks like the mechanism of showing the face of the war doesn't work anymore. So do you think that it's possible?
It's a really great question. I disagree slightly. I do think it helps to show the face of the war. I remember there was, in Syria, there was a picture of a little boy who was bleeding, and that picture went all over. I forgot it was after some kind of a bombing attack.
In Syria.
In Syria, yeah, and he was sitting there bleeding and looking for his parents and looking. That picture really got people involved. I think the main problem now is there are not enough images coming out. Journalists can't get into Syria very much, so we don't see very many images of the war, so that's why it's invisible. Someone asked me earlier today when I was doing another event why the Americans don't know much about the war going on here in eastern Ukraine. And I said, because there's no pictures. There's no pictures of anything because journalists can't get there. So I think the problem now is there aren't any pictures of the little girl running down the street. That was so dramatic. I think it's really interesting, I think, because one of the lessons I think that militaries, the U.S. military definitely and around the world learned from the Vietnam War is don't let us in. Don't let journalists in. In Vietnam was fascinating because journalists could go anywhere. Journalists could go anywhere they wanted to. Now, when there's a conflict, the military has learned keep the journalist out, and that way those images like the one you described, or there was another famous image of the Vietnam War of a policeman holding a gun to a suspect's head. You don't see those images coming out of eastern Ukraine or out of Syria because the journalists are restricted. That's partly because militaries have learned not to, and they've learned the lesson that journalists, manipulating information is part of the war. And you can manipulate the information a lot better if you keep journalists out, then you can control the narrative. But the other thing, it's also a part of it's a function of the fact that journalists now have become targets. In the Vietnam War, journalists used to be able to go over to the communist side and interview, they could interview communists in Hanoi and then come back to Saigon again. In World War II, for a long time, there were American and British journalists on the German side, but you can't do that anymore. I'm not quite sure when that changed, but now we are considered combatants, or we're considered one side or the other. Ukrainian journalists can't just go to the other side and just say I'm a journalist and report freely. The same way that Western journalists can't go into Syria and just report freely; they'll be targeted. And so that's the main problem. So I don't think it's that there are no images. I think that it's impossible for journalists to get those types of images. But when they do come out, it does, I think, impact public emotion and public impression. So I think the trick is to get those images out. The other problem now, too, is combatants have learned to send out fake images. There are sometimes images come out all the time. Images are coming out from Syria that they say this is a poison gas attack by Syria. And you do some you can on Google, you can go back and do image searches, and you say, well, actually, this is a picture that's 10 years old. It's Kurds from the Iraq War. Often there are pictures coming out from Myanmar that people claim it's a Rohingya terrorists have done something, and you can actually do Google searches and find out, no, that's a picture from Bangladesh from 20 years ago. So people are now trying to manipulate those images is one of the huge problems going on. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from the other field, but it's like, actually, this is something that's been discussed on all the podcasts about media and the place of media today. So it's about Mr. President Trump and the conflict with CNN and Washington Post. As a journalist, and again, as a professor who teaches and actually put this ethical issue before in front of the students. I'm not asking you here to take the sides, obviously, but I'm just curious about your point of view in this situation, whether it's ethical for journalists to be involved in this kind of discussions, or whether it's ethical not to be involved in this kind of
discussion with the president.
With the conflict, and whether it's ethical for the president to react in the ways he's reacting, or not a president, any public figure actually. Like, could you share your vision of the current discussion that is everywhere, actually, in the field of journalism?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't like us being called fake news, and I don't like us being called the enemies of the American people. I think journalism is a pillar of democracy. On the other hand, I always like to remind people that, we've seen worse periods, before. I don't know if you saw this movie called The Post, which was just out recently about the Washington Post and the Pentagon Papers. During the Nixon administration, it was really hostile between the journalist and the Nixon White House. President Nixon kept a list of his enemies, and journalists were on that list. He barred Washington Post reporters from the White House. He had the tax authority, we called it the Internal Revenue Service, investigating the tax returns of journalists. I mean, there was some nasty stuff, going on during the Nixon administration. The Watergate break-in was just kind of the tip of that iceberg. So it was really, really hostile during that period. So I think, we're not quite at that level of hostility where there's agencies of the U.S. government looking into the tax returns of journalists now. So we just have to keep reminding ourselves that we've gone through periods of tension and hostility before. I don't, as I said, I don't like it because if it erodes public trust in journalism, but I think it's a good thing that there's a bit of an adversarial relationship between the White House and the journalists, because I think great reporting comes out. And I think we went through a long period when maybe the journalists got a little bit too cozy with the people in power. And I didn't like that a lot. I don't like these kind of White House correspondents' dinners where they all put on tuxedos and laugh together and all that. I'd rather they be butting heads. And if I were an editor of the Washington Post, I'd say, let's stop covering the White House briefings. They're boring anyway. Just send all those reporters out and just digging into tax returns and getting real investigative stories going on. So I think that tension's a good thing. Yeah, I think there was one waiting up here too. A gentleman in the black shirt here is waiting patiently. English or Ukrainian?
I have the following question for you. Supposing you are middle career journalist and you were given assignment to go to the war conflict. Suddenly you come across a little child bleeding with blood. And you have two choices, whether to give this child first medical aid, because in a minute or two he or she will die, or you may take a picture of this child, and this picture would expose war criminals. So what will be your choice? What you will do first? To give this child medical help, or to take this sensational picture like Napalm Girl style?
Yeah.
Provocative question.
Provocative question. That actually is a real, that really happened. That situation really happened.
Any regulations how to conduct in this situation?
Look, everybody has to react to that situation individually. I mean, obviously you'd want to help the child, but you have to, in that circumstance, if you're the only one there, et cetera. There was a real circumstance there was a famine in the African country of Sudan, and a South African journalist named Kevin Carter was there taking photographs. And I don't know if there was a very famous photograph. It won the Pulitzer Prize of a starving little child kind of hunched over, and there was a vulture sitting there waiting for the child to die. And he took the picture, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. He was a freelancer. And it was a beautiful picture, and he later was criticized by everybody for saying, why did you take the picture? Why didn't you help the child? Now, there were a couple of reasons. He said after he took the picture, he tried to get a rock and hit the vulture so the vulture would go away. And he went down the road and told where there was a United Nations tent, and told the United Nations worker that there's a child there, down the road where the child was. But people still criticized him, saying, you should have put the child in your car and taken the child there. The reason he didn't was because aid workers in those situations told us, because they told me in Rwanda, and they told me in Somalia, if you see kids like that on the road, don't pick them up because they have various diseases. And they say, if you pick that kid up, you're going to end up getting diseased or something or other. So just tell us where they are. We go out in medical gloves and we'll get the child. But that wasn't enough. So Kevin Carter, this photographer, was tormented by the criticism he got, and he committed suicide. Yeah, he committed suicide because he thought he made the wrong choice. So, you're confronted with that all the time. I always try to tell myself when I'm in those situations that, and I've been in many of those situations, that obviously you do something for what you can with somebody in front of you. You can hand them a bottle of water if you've got extra water. But again, you have to remember, if you're in some of these circumstances, you only have limited water of your own. So if you start giving it away to everyone you see, you're not going to have water for yourself. I always try to tell myself, though, that I can do more for this entire situation by publishing this story and getting it out there. People will read that story and then start contributing money to the UN agencies that are trying to raise funds than I can do by helping the one person or the two people in front of me. But again, you have to do what you can if you can do something helpful. In Afghanistan, after the fall of the Taliban in Kabul, my photographer friend and I were driving around doing interviews everywhere, and we found an orphanage, and we went in and we talked to the people running the orphanage, and we saw these children were there, and they were very hungry, not quite starving, but very hungry. So we finished our interviews. When we finished, then we went to a marketplace, and we bought a lot of bags of food and rice, and we took it back and just dropped it off at the orphanage for the kids. But we made sure we'd get our interviews first, and then we gave them a bit of food that we could buy in the marketplace. So, we did little things like that when you could. But again, that's just, what we can do is just a drop in the bucket compared to what one powerful story can do, which can then get public attention on something. But yeah, in that situation, if I can do something for one person in front of me, of course, I'm a human being. I would probably try to do that. But it's a dilemma that journalists get asked all the time. There's one other situation I know. I don't want to belabor this, but there was a U.S. presidential campaign going on in 1996 when Bob Dole was running for president of the United States against Bill Clinton. Bob Dole, I don't know if you know, he was paralyzed on one side from World War II injuries. And he was shaking hands on a stage, and he started to fall off the stage. And because he was paralyzed on one side, he couldn't stop himself. One of the photographers who was down dropped his camera and caught him before he fell and injured himself. The other photographers criticized that photographer by saying, you messed up the picture. Because if he had fallen, that would have been an amazing picture. And your job was to take the picture, not capture it. And the other photographer said, you interfered with history. So again, you have to make those. I would have caught him too, but again, you're interfering with history. You're not supposed to do that as a journalist, but you're still a human being first. So yeah. But it's a tough question, and journalists confront those things all the time, particularly in those situations like you described. There's plenty of questions here. Maybe one here. Look, we need a lady here, and then over there. Oh, here. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a light in my eyes there. Can't see.
No problem. So, of course, traditional legacy media is still a vital source of information. However, increasingly we see citizen journalists playing a role in shaping the narrative of conflicts, and the internet, specifically Web 2.0, has provided average people with the ability to publish their own content off of their smartphones with little to no cost. For example, you have the Palestinians, where they're tweeting photos and videos of shelling, which has resulted in greater sympathy for their cause and their conflict with Israel. Israel may be winning the physical war, but they seem to be losing the narrative one, and in that these personal, emotional anecdotes make the Israelis look bad. Whether that's justified or not, I'm not taking a position. But so the digital citizen journalism is disrupting the narratives of conflict, narratives that were usually controlled or managed by the state or legacy media. So what I'd like to ask is, how do you foresee social media altering the understanding of future conflicts? Do you believe this will lead to greater transparency or open us up to greater risk and make it more difficult to reach compromises?
That's a very good question. I think, it definitely is changing the way conflicts are covered, social media. And I mentioned earlier the example of Syria, because we can't get into Syria, so most of the reporting we get out is being done by people with these devices who are going around filming what they say are the aftermath of a gas attack or the aftermath of a chemical attack, and they're sending these pictures out. When things happen in Iran, for example, when there are demonstrations and if the security forces open fire, we see that on Facebook or we see these images uploaded to Twitter. I think it's for, in terms of our knowledge of what's happening in closed areas, I think it's great. But we have to be very careful because you don't have professional journalists who are providing the context, and you don't know if those images are always truthful. That's the main problem with them. So I think there's still a major role for professional journalists, and I still count myself as one, even though I'm teaching. I think there's still a main role for professional journalists to take those images, put them through the same rigorous, skeptical examination you would do any other type of reporting. How do you know that image is true? How do you know that picture is where it's from? We teach this in our journalism school. We show people, we have the students look at a bunch of images, and we try to say, try to figure out where that image is from. There are ways you can do it based on the clothing people are wearing. You look for little signs. You can discover things if you look very closely at images. You can actually do searches of the computer codes that things came from. So if someone says this is an image from Syria, but it's actually coming from a URL address that's from somewhere else, you can take it with a bit of skepticism. And you must and at the very end of that fact-checking process, you still have to be able to, you still must say, we cannot independently verify that this is what it says it is. But I think it's great that we're getting some images out. I haven't seen that many images from the Eastern Ukraine conflict. Maybe they've been coming out here locally. I haven't seen them internationally. But I think there need to be more of these images coming out. So I think definitely that citizen journalism is changing the way we cover conflicts in a good way, in the sense that it's giving us more information. But I think, as I said, I think we still need the professional journalist to give that the same, number one, to give it the crucial eye to be able to tell skeptically whether this is true or not, but secondly, to provide context. Because just getting images of people being shot or bodies doesn't tell you the context of the war that's going on, or what does this picture mean? What is this image about? And the other thing about citizen journalism that you have to be skeptical of, and I'm not saying don't believe it, I'm just saying be skeptical. Anytime anyone gives me information as a journalist, I'm always wondering what that person's motive is for talking to me. Whether it's a diplomat or a military official, anytime they talk to me, they know they're talking to a journalist. They have an agenda. They have a reason they're talking to me. Likewise, anytime someone sends you those images out of a war zone, they have a reason they're sending you that image, which is normally that they want to demonize the other side, or they want to show that the other side is committing abuses, or they want to show that their side is winning. So that's generally that. So you have to always take that into account when you're dealing with non-professional journalists who are sending out that type of information. But I think it's great that it's coming out, but we just have to filter it. I hope that answers your question.
I wanted to just follow up.
Do you have a follow-up? Yeah.
Because my concern is mostly that the legacy media has served as gatekeepers for information, and now it's not necessarily the legacy media that's using social media and use social media sources or citizen journalist sources and then publishing it. It's more the fact that people are now turning to citizen journalists and taking everything at face value, and
that's a huge problem.
That's the problem.
Because journalists for the legacy publications like CNN, they will take those images from people who say they're inside of Syria. They will put them through their process of checking them before they put them on the air. But you can now see these things live off of Facebook, YouTube, wherever it is. Like the Palestinians you mentioned, they can put things on directly. It's partly the responsibility of the consumer. It's the responsibility of all of you when you see this stuff to recognize this is coming from one side. This has not, been vetted by professional journalists. I don't really know the context of this, but we too often believe things we see on the internet, and we sometimes forward these things or post these things or repost these things without checking. I mean, you would not repost a story that somebody sent to you that said Elvis is alive and living on the moon, but somehow you get an image coming out of the Palestinian territories that shows an Israeli atrocity, and you might be more, not you personally, but someone might be more willing to repost that without knowing that this is true or not. So we tend to put a little bit more skepticism on a supermarket magazine we see that shows that Elvis is alive than we put on an image coming out of a war zone. And I think we need everybody in this room and everybody outside needs to be more skeptical and be better consumers of news, I think. And I have a couple in the front here. Oh, and then in the back, sorry. One here and then one there.
Okay.
I should go first.
Thank you. You told about the role of quality pictures in the conflict zone, and you told also that in America, in Vietnam, journalists were allowed to make picture everywhere they want in the conflict zone. But the main reason in our conflict why we are not allowed to make pictures, it's security. So what about security? Because it's even not about security of journalists, but about security of soldiers, of our militaries, because you can fix some important position or weapon or something like that, and enemy can fix it also.
Yeah.
What about it?
No, absolutely. That's
Why it was? Why you have not such kind of problem?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You need to be able to report on the military without exposing their positions or sometimes their weaponry, et cetera. That was what I was speaking of in answer to an earlier question, which is, military has definition. Has a reason to have secrecy in a lot of ways. They need to have that kind of secrecy. They don't want the other side to know what they're doing. The one way we got around that in Somalia, in Afghanistan, we would try to work with the military. We would go with them and say, take us with you. You tell us where we can point the camera and where we can't point the camera. You tell us what we can report and tell us what we don't want to report. So if you go in by yourself, the military might see you as a problem or an obstacle, but if you work with them, and again, I would usually go in at the top in Afghanistan, for example. I would go into the top level of the military, talk to the officers, get a briefing, and then ask them, can I go out with your soldiers? Tell me what I could say. And they'd say, well, we're going to Helmand province in Afghanistan. Don't report where we are, but you can talk to the soldiers. Don't say, we also would not say where the hometowns were, where the hometown of the soldier, because these Taliban guys are, they're terrorists. They might try to find the family member of that soldier if you reported what hometown they're from. So, there are little things like that. But, again, we tried to just ask them and work with them before, to try to get to try to get stories out, because they also wanted to tell their story. They had a good story to tell. They thought they were doing good things in this conflict, but also we just had to respect their need for secrecy, especially in the field. So so I think there should, and again, there's a little bit of a negotiation going on because military wants to keep everything secret, and sometimes things don't really need to be secret. I hope that answers you. Yeah. Okay, I have one up here.
I have some thoughts about that you say that Ukrainian journalists don't have access to the other side. It's not completely true, because I have been on Donetsk twice, 2 years ago, and I was here as a Ukrainian journalist, but as independent journalist. And the truth is, believe me, that we don't have, the Ukrainian journalists don't have permission from the owners of Ukrainian media to come to Donetsk, to the other side of the war now, because after that they have it will be safety, but it's political question now. And my question is for you is personality. You told that journalists have post-traumatic disorder syndrome, and I completely agree with you, because I feel it when I come back. And then I've started working about the documentary of post-traumatic syndrome of soldiers, and it's like a therapy for me as a journalist. And what is your experience? How you cope with PTSD?
Yeah, good question. And my apologies if you've been into to the other side. I don't know the conflict here. I was just being told that journalists had a hard time going over to the eastern side. I don't know the reason for that. I didn't know if they're being blocked by the Ukrainian side or being blocked by the Russians, or they just feel it's too dangerous to go. But if you've been there, That's terrific. If you've gotten post-traumatic stress, that's common. That's not uncommon. I mean, most journalists suffer from some form of it. Everybody has different ways of coping. I never had any kind of major issues with it. I've had friends who've had major issues of post-traumatic stress. One of the main ways I can tell is because they feel more comfortable going into the war zone than being out of it. When they're out, they can't wait to get back in. They think everything in life is too boring here, and they need to be in Baghdad or they need to be in Afghanistan. And that's when I think that they need to be away from it for a while. Sometimes you see when we all came out of Somalia, we were all nervous. We were all coming out of Somalia. There were 4 or 5 journalists sitting in Nairobi, and we were all sitting on the balcony of this hotel having beers and talking about the war. And a car, when a car backfires and it makes a big loud noise, we all jumped and fit the floor immediately because we forgot we were in Nairobi. We thought we were back in Somalia again. And the waiter was looking at us like, what are these guys doing on the floor? So sometimes, loud noises make you go back and think, oh my God, they're attacking us again or something like that. But again, I mean, talking about it is usually the best thing. Too many times journalists think, especially male journalists, they think it's too much. They're macho and they don't want to admit that they're having problems or they're having nightmares, so they don't want to talk to anyone. So talking is the best thing. I always found it was cathartic for me. It was a relief for me to just write. I loved writing the story. Once I wrote the story, and if you saw things horrible, write about it and put all the images down on paper and write it. And sometimes those stories are the most moving stories because you're pouring your heart out onto your story there for what you've seen. Because are you a writer?
No, I'm
for the video. You're a filmmaker. Yeah, put it into your film and show the audience what you saw. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, that's a, we're all creative people in a way, and the way we deal with things is to create. So put it out there so people can see it and let them know what you're going through. But again, just don't try to hide it and don't try to internalize it, but talk to people. When I was the foreign editor of the Washington Post, we had a bureau in Baghdad, and I had to keep an eye on. We had a few people there, but I had to keep an eye on them because we had a rule that they did 4 to 6 weeks inside of Iraq. And then I made them do 4 weeks outside. And sometimes they protested. They wanted to stay because the story was getting big. I said, nope, you're out of there. Go somewhere else. Go to the beach. Go to Spain and eat, paella or something, and then come. But you can go back in 4 weeks. But once you came out, you had to spend 4 weeks outside. And that was kind of our rules to keep people, just to know that there is a normal world outside of this kind of crazy bubble. Who else has some questions? Let's get somebody who hasn't had one. Hold on one second. The microphone.
Yeah. So you would like to say that journalists may have post-traumatic syndrome after their work in the territory of conflict, and journalists need psychological medical help. Yes. Well, am I right?
They could. Yeah. I mean, they could need it. Yes. They should recognize if they are having stress problems and then seek out help. Yes.
And how long did it take to you to recover from the stress from the situation after working in the conflict zone?
Well, I never really had major problems, but I could recognize friends who had major problems with it. So I was lucky, I think.
And how much did it take for them to recover?
Some haven't recovered. I mean, some still have it. Some still have it. Like years later, some I know some friends who still are going into Iraq and Afghanistan, and that I talk to them on email or Facebook Messenger, which is convenient, and I sort of say, I say, look, why are you still going to Iraq? You're too old. Why are you still going to Baghdad? Let somebody else do it. And so, I mean, I can tell that they just can't. It's in their system that they have to get this. We call it adrenaline. They get an emotional rush out of being in dangerous places, and they get bored, when they're back home. So I can tell that they're still suffering from it. I've got friends who've told me belatedly after the fact that they said, I think I'm suffering from some traumatic stress. That's why they drink too much, or that's why they're irritable when they're out, or they find everything. One of the key signs is when they're out, they find everything here boring because it's not as exciting as getting shot at.
And it's an interesting point to study because I'm not a journalist, I'm a scientific researcher, and my research concerns like working journalist in the conflict society, in the conflict stage of society. So it's interesting. It's like it was a very interesting question. It's like something. Something new for me, for my research, this point.
It's a really, really important topic. We don't do enough on it. Look, only recently did we start treating soldiers for post-traumatic stress. I mean, in the old days, soldiers, if they, were, suffering something and they couldn't go out, we said, you're a coward, get back out there. So now what they're starting to recognize that it's a legitimate illness that people can suffer from. I think with journalists now, we're just getting to that point where we recognize that they see things. And it doesn't have to necessarily be conflict. Journalists who came out of covering hurricane situations in the States, like Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed a lot of, some of them said they were seeing bodies floating around, and it's, they saw a lot of things they shouldn't have, nobody should want to see. Covering, earthquakes or landslides, if you see a lot of dead bodies around, or there was a natural disaster in Japan, a tsunami, and some of the journalists even coming from there just said, once you see, bodies around and little children unburied under a school and, something like that in an earthquake zone, that can be just as stressful as conflict, when you see that kind of death and destruction around you. So, yeah, I think it's an area that doesn't get enough attention. Columbia University in the U.S. has a center now that deals with traumatic stress for journalists. It's a new, I forgot the name of the center, but I can find that for you.
Maybe you could give me the name.
Yeah, give me your card later. I'll find that. But I know Columbia University has a new center that looks specifically at that issue, dealing with traumatic stress with journalists. It's a huge area. Let's get somebody who hasn't had a question yet first, and I'll get back to you, I promise. Okay, we have two in a row.
Yes. Thank you, sir, for such an informative and inspiring intake on crisis coverage.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question, several questions, in fact, regarding your experience. Have you ever been embedded with a military unit?
Yes.
If yes, have you experienced some pressure from the military, or being made to face like ground rules and being asked to submit the article before it being put out for sanitization so that it does not compromise any operational security? Yeah. And if yes, so how often did you get asked for?
I was only embedded briefly for about a week or two, because I preferred to be not embedded. But I did go down embedded. I was embedded for about a week in Afghanistan with a U.S. Military unit that it drove me around, because that was the only way to get around that very dangerous part of Afghanistan. Under the rules, when you're embedded, you're supposed to submit everything for clearance beforehand. They don't really enforce that rule, or at that point in time, they weren't enforcing that rule. So I just, I was riding in, it was several vehicles, and I was riding in the vehicle with a young captain. And, when I was writing my story, I just kind of read him some bits and said, is it okay if I say this? And he basically was fine with everything. He didn't really have it. But again, I was a little bit experienced, so I knew not to say exactly where we were, et cetera. And I just kind of described what, we were in a firefight, and I just kind of described it, pretty accurately, and he didn't really have any problems with it. I think if you're in the command headquarters, especially at the beginning of the Iraq War, my Washington Post colleagues told me that they had to actually submit a copy of their story or send it by email to the U.S. military public affairs people, but they said they didn't really censor it per se. I mean, they might say, could you just take out this location or something like that, something very minor. But again, it was not major, there's no rewriting of it. It's usually just a matter of taking out a name or taking out, a lot of times they don't want you to put in people's names. But that was the main thing.
And during that embed period, you were escorted all the time by the public affairs officers, or you were just with a regular?
Well, there was no PR public affairs officer. I was just in a Jeep with a young captain and his gunner and someone in the back and me in the back seat. And there were about 4 or 5 vehicles in a row, and we drove from a couple of villages around. But nobody cared who I was talking to. I could talk to anybody in that unit. No, they were all very friendly, actually. The funny thing about that was, well, first of all, I was in my 40s, and these were all like 18 and 19-year-old kids, and I realized when they go running up hills and things, I couldn't keep up with them. But they were all incredibly friendly, and that's what I meant. Sometimes they were telling you things about where they were last week or where they think they're going next week, and that's the sort of thing where you kind of say, I probably shouldn't write that because it's revealing a little bit too much information.
And last question.
Yeah.
How often do you get reached out by the public affairs officers or public affairs or media crisis centers run by the military? How often do you get reached out by them?
Oh, all the time. I mean, yeah, but we talk to them all the time. Because I was in Afghanistan, for example, in Kabul. I would call the U.S. military maybe once or twice a day to ask what's happening, what have they heard. If I were leaving the city, the capital city, and going out into the provinces, I would first call them and get what they call a SIT report, which is a situation report, to find out, is it safe to go there? Can I drive on this highway? What are you hearing? It's a kind of a back and forth situation. They don't really try to manipulate, but often you want to comment. You want that public affairs office to comment on something that you're hearing, so you're actually kind of sharing information in a lot of ways. So there's a lot more kind of, once you're in the field, there's a lot more kind of cooperation than there is conflict, I find. Right.
So
with the U.S. military,
right,
anyways.
But there was no problem with building rapport with the military. I mean, with the journalists and...
I could talk to soldiers easy, you go in and you talk about American football and hey, where you guys from? Everybody wants to talk to somebody from their home country. So when you're in the middle of Afghanistan or Iraq and they see an American coming up, they say, "What are you doing here?" I say, "Hey, I came out to see what you guys are doing. What's going on?" And take cigarettes and whiskey, and you can usually talk to any soldier.
Yep. Thank you, sir.
Sure. And right behind you there's a question.
Hello. I would like to ask you, when you have been assigned to a foreign country, did you always know the foreign language?
No, not at all. No.
So you relied very heavily on the local translator, right?
Yeah. You generally have to rely on translators.
Basically, you saw everything through his or her eyes, but your eyes, and you heard everything through her voice or his voice. Yeah.
Yes.
How do you divide the opinion, the subjective opinion of your translator from the facts that you get?
Yeah, it's hard, and you have to know. Well, first of all, when you're going into a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, where the Washington Post had been there since the beginning, we had our own people who worked for us. So, when I would fly into Afghanistan, the Washington Post local Afghan translator would come and pick me up at the airport, and so we trusted that person because he worked for us for many years. I think he's still there, actually. He follows me on Twitter now. Yeah, and in Iraq the same way. Iraq was a bit different because I went in on my own. We were just invading the country, and I had to find my own translators because we didn't have someone who we knew and trusted. So in that case, I went to the Red Cross, actually, and I actually took one of their translators. I actually asked them if I could borrow one of their translators for a while. But again, again, when you're dealing through translators, you never know 100% that you're getting an accurate information. But the problem is often, as was the case in Afghanistan and more the case in Iraq, most of the people who were intelligent and spoke English had already fled. They were out of the country, so we had to deal with the dregs. So I remember going into Afghanistan, when the Taliban were still in charge, and it was really hard to find a translator who spoke really good English who hadn't already fled the country. So we were dealing with some guys whose English was not very good. And I'll tell you a funny story. The exiled president of the Northern Alliance, which was a faction that was backed by the United States, this exiled president came back into Afghanistan for the first time after the Taliban fled. He gave a big speech, and I had this terrible translator sitting next to me, and the guy was speaking in the Afghan language, and in his speech he said, Afghanistan was taken over by tourists, and we will never allow tourists again into Afghanistan. And I'm thinking, what the heck is he saying? And he said, tourists have destroyed Afghanistan, and we don't want tourism here. And I said, what is he talking about? And someone leaned over and said, he means terrorism.
Okay, thank you.
There's another famous story when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over in Iran after the revolution there. My colleague from the Washington Post was there, and the Ayatollah gave a press conference for the foreign journalists. So the Ayatollah was on one side of the room, the translator sat in the middle of the room, and the journalists are on the other side. And the Ayatollah spoke something, And the translator said, the Ayatollah says that now the revolution is complete. And the Ayatollah spoke again. And the translator said, we will now cut off the hands of the foreign journalists. And all the journalists immediately sat on their hands. And then the Ayatollah said something kind of angrily, and the translator said, oh, correction, he said foreign imperialists. There's a whole book to be written about bad translators. I'll tell you one other story, though. I remember sometimes you'll know you're not getting a good translation when I'm talking to a refugee, in Afghanistan who's come out of this village, and I said, "What happened in your village?" And the woman's talking and she's gesturing and she's speaking for like 2 or 3 minutes. I said, "What did she say?" "Oh, she said very bad, very bad." Yes, you've been waiting patiently up here in the front.
A little addition to a previous question, and my question is about events in Rwanda in 1994. How you overcame the temptation to spread subjective information in conflict between Hutu and Tutsi?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always say that my job as a journalist is not to be objective. My job is to be truthful. And I have a moral obligation to tell the truth, not to be objective. And I define that as saying when you're objective in the journalistic sense, you're saying the one side says this, the other side says this, and I'm going to treat these two sides equally. As a journalist, I knew in that situation that there was one side, the Hutus, who were massacring Tutsis. So I had to report that the way I saw it. So I didn't try to just sort of say, oh, there are two sides having a civil war and they're both equally at fault. No, that's not true. What was true was that one side was killing the other side. And I think a lot of us during that period of the 1990s in journalism threw away this idea of being objective and decided that our real job as journalists was to be truthful. I know my colleagues who were I was covering the Rwanda war, Somalia and Rwanda, while my colleagues at the Washington Post were covering the war in the former Yugoslavia. And again, they said, look, the Serbs are massacring Bosnian Muslims, so we can't just sort of pretend that on the one side this, on the other side that. That's one of the problems where these days, because there's this information warfare going on, people try to use journalistic objectivity to get us to sort of say both sides are equal. But I think the journalist's job is to try to get to the truth, because both sides are not always equal in these sorts of situations. So objectivity is a crutch, I think, that we need to get away from this idea of being objective and go to the idea of let's be fair, let's make sure that we can present both sides of the story, but then let's be truthful. And if one side is committing war crimes, we need to say that. Yeah, one over there, great T-shirt, and then over here afterwards.
Thank you very much for your lecture. My question in follow-up to the woman over there was, did you ever quote from translators as a first question?
Yeah, you have to be very careful. I mean, you have to say in your story that this refugee woman said through a translator that, because I don't know. Often if you're in a place long enough, you kind of can pick up a few words here and there. But you don't know enough to be able to translate fluently. But there are many, as I said, there are many stories where people mistranslated, etc. There's a famous story actually where someone was getting someone was using a translator to talk to someone who was describing a bombing that they thought was some chemical weapon, and the person translated. The woman spoke. The translator said, "Oh, she's an old woman. She doesn't really understand what she's saying." And the journalist, my friend, said, "No, just tell me what she said." So, "Oh, she's a silly woman. She's a peasant. She doesn't really understand." And they said, "Just tell me what she said." He said, "It was like a bird came from the sky and dropped something orange." He said, "That's a beautiful quote. So just tell me exactly what the person says next time." So often you have to force the translator to tell you exactly what the person said, which is sometimes better, because sometimes the translators do try to put their own spin on things, etc. But you have to be very careful if you're quoting through a translator to make sure that people know that it's a translator you're using. And I could speak French and English, which doesn't help you in some of these countries. But it's one of the things I've discovered, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, is if you find a doctor, they always speak English. So in Iraq, I made sure if I were going into a new village, like in Nasiriyah, I went to the local hospital because the doctors always spoke English, so I could talk to them directly without the translator. And unfortunately, English is not a bad language because everybody speaks a little bit, everywhere. The other problem you run into is if someone's speaking in kind of bad English, that you have to kind of quote them, but you don't want to quote them speaking in bad English, but you can't really clean it up, is the other problem.
Okay. My second question would be, you talked a little bit about like you are going with the military, and you used the expression, maybe it's been a little bit, I don't know, it's been creating some pictures when you said, well, look here and don't maybe look there. And I think, of course, like you are presupposing a little bit like maybe more trust than there is today among your readers when you say, well, trust us, we are taking out some parts, but just parts like the location, which is reasonable, but we are leaving it in other parts. So this is like presupposing a lot of trust, which today is more of a problem. And I mean, particularly, if you could go into one specific detail, it's all nice and fine to say like, okay, this guy is from Pittsburgh, let's leave that out. But when you say we are leaving out where the CIA torture sites are, to countries, which is like of enormous interest in those countries, that you have a CIA black site in Poland, European Union, in a democracy, is a very, very, very big deal.
Yes.
And you need an extremely good justification for that. Otherwise, you lose trust probably very quickly, if you could answer that.
Again, you're absolutely right. It was an agonizing decision to leave that information out, but they made a very good point that there were Egyptian and Polish troops in Iraq. And if the word got out that those two countries were torturing prisoners, then those soldiers might be then targeted very specifically by that information. I mean, again, it's tricky. And again, I mean, you have to build up trust with your readers. And again, I know as a general rule, trust in the media is down, but we had to just go on the assumption that the readers of the Washington Post trusted us enough to make that decision. And the fact that we actually said we were leaving it out, we think helped trust. We could have just written the story and just not said where the sites were. We could have just said someplace in Eastern Europe and someplace in the Middle East. But we thought we would help build trust with the readers by saying, we know where these places are, but at the request of the U.S. government, we are going to leave out the actual names of the country. I mean, I don't know if that's the right decision. We could probably go back and forth on that one. But again, I mean, I think it's better to say, we are leaving out some information as opposed to just leaving it out and not telling the reader that you're leaving it out, if that makes sense. And I promised black T-shirt here. Oh, is that a T-shirt? Oh, I can't see. It might be a dress.
Yeah. No, it's a T-shirt. Thank you, Mr. Richburg, for a really interesting talk. I have also two questions. The first one is, what's your opinion about the future of print journalism? Because you've been working for a lot of years in a big, famous, successful newspaper. And at the same time, I see that you use a lot and talk a lot about online media, social media. You work with the students who are really, I think, deep online. Yeah. So, what's your opinion about the press, print, and the threats, both threats and pros and cons of online journalism?
Yeah, I think print media is definitely on the way out. I think it'll be around a little bit longer, as long as there are old people like me and my friend Mike here who like to still read things in print, because our eyes get glazed over if I'm looking at a phone too long. And it's nice to fold a newspaper out with your feet up, sometimes. But I think we're dying out. Everybody, But the thing is that I find interesting is that it's all about stories. It's all about the content of stories. And whether you're reading it this way or reading it in a newspaper, it doesn't really matter. But it's still got to be a darn good story. And if the story is good, I don't really care how you read it, And so yeah, I think newspapers will still be around for a while, just because people always said books will disappear now that you can read books on your devices. But there are still books around, and people like me still like to collect books, and I think there will be still a few people who want to read newspapers. I don't think newspapers will never be the dominant form that they were in the past, but I think there's going to be a little niche, small market for newspapers, at least in the foreseeable future. Maybe in 50 years, there won't be any more newspapers. Online, I think, is terrific. I mean, we can do a lot. It's more convenient. You can do a lot more online than you ever could before. I mean, before, when I was in Africa, I remember I was called. I was in bed, actually, in my office, and Washington called me in the middle of the night and said that the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down by a missile. That started the Rwanda genocide. It's the first time in history that 2 presidents were killed in one attack. And they said, "Can you get to Burundi right away?" I said, yeah, no, absolutely, I can get there right away. And I hung up the phone and said, what's the capital of Burundi? I had no idea. So I had to go find a dictionary and like look up Burundi and find the capital. And then I had to, how do you get there? I had no idea how you get there. It took me hours to figure out where was Burundi. And I was living in Kenya, so you're in charge of all of Africa. But Burundi was not on my map. I had no idea where it was, no idea what the capital was, no idea what the name of the president was. And it took me hours to figure all of this out. Now I could find that in about 60 seconds on Google. So this has made our lives a whole lot easier. So the journalists, the young students I teach, I try to tell them that, when I was your age, I had to go to the library and bicycle 6 miles in the snow to get a library book and read about Africa. They're not impressed. But and they're a lot more informed than ever before because of these devices now, or because of Google. You can read a newspaper from anywhere in the world. If you want to know what's happening in Israel, you can read the Jerusalem Post. I can go online and probably read the Kiev Post if I want to know what's happening here. You can read newspapers from everywhere. But all of this information coming at us, I don't think necessarily has made us better informed, because we're not filtering it all out. So we have this avalanche of information at our fingertips, but I don't think people now are better informed than they were before. And I think you probably were more informed when you had kind of one big daily newspaper that, with professional editors, we talked about that before, who filtered this stuff through and organized the newspaper in a way that I found easily to understand. I knew this story was the most important because it was down the right-hand column. This story was important but least important because it was here. Here's a fun story because they always put the fun stories down at the bottom. I knew how a newspaper was organized. I don't know how a website's organized these days because the stories move. One day the story's here, then it's down here, and it moves around, and you click on the same news site an hour later, and the story's gone. Things disappear quickly. So I find things on the internet site move around too much, and I don't have a sense of what's important anymore. And the second thing is I find that there's a lot more mistakes that get through because there's such a hurry to get things out that people don't think. People don't have time to think and reflect and actually decide what is it important about this story. Now the minute I hear something, the minute Mr. Poroshenko says something, you have to go online and put it out that he says this. You don't have time to check to see, is this true? What do other people think about this? What does this mean? Maybe I should talk to somebody. There's no time because you're in a hurry to get things out. So speed, to me, is the enemy of good journalism.
And my second question is also about the threats of the online world, of the internet. You mentioned that disinformation in Ukraine really suffer from it, from the state-run Russian disinformation that Russia spread on TV, in foreign languages, also online. You know about cyber attacks, spies, and all this stuff. But for a couple of years, the world feels that it's not the Ukrainian or post-Soviet or even Eastern Europe problem, it's the whole problem for such threats, because this case with the Facebook and Facebook ad and Russian trolls and the connection with the President Trump. Yes. So what's your opinion on how to fight the state-run propaganda, actually?
It's hard. Look, I mean, these days information has been weaponized. Information is now a weapon, and we have to recognize that. And I think everybody in this room and everybody outside has to become a more literate consumer of news. We have to recognize that a lot of the stuff we're getting is propaganda. We have to recognize that Facebook is a platform that anybody can put news on. So just because it appears in your Facebook feed does not mean that it's true. We have to become better citizens. I think all of us have a responsibility. We can't rely on journalists to go out there and debunk every rumor going on. We can't rely on governments to pass law. We need to make ourselves more literate consumers of news. And it's going to take a long time. I mean, we teach a course at my university called News Literacy. We're trying now to create a new course so we could take it into high schools in Hong Kong to teach younger kids. A colleague of mine in the States is creating one for the U.S. to take into high schools, because you have to start young, and you have to teach young people that not to believe all of this stuff, or how there's a lot of fake news, real fake news I call it, not what the president calls fake news, but real fake news, disinformation, all of this stuff, and you have to know how to recognize this stuff. You know how you already we know instinctively how to recognize fake news when it's in the supermarket newspaper. We call them tabloids in the States. The one that says, you know, Martians came from outer space and took my baby, or I saw Elvis walking that. We know that's fake. We know, we see it and we know it. But somehow when it's online, we tend to believe it more and more. That's what we have to figure out, is how to get people as skeptical of this disinformation washing around as they are of this weird stuff we see in the, we call them supermarket tabloid newspapers.
So the solution is to teach actually kids in schools and
absolutely, absolutely,
okay.
Educate the public.
Thank you.
And I think we got a couple more up here in the front who've been waiting patiently.
Just a remark. So, in this case, there is such a subject like media literacy, and media literacy is now a topic #1 in Europe and the USA.
Absolutely.
And we developed a new course of media literacy, and we plan to introduce it into for schools.
That's great.
But not for primary school. For
high school.
High school.
High school. Yeah. No, exactly. No, I think that's great. Is that in Ukraine? You're doing it?
Yeah. No. It's my also project, like media literacy, but psycholinguistic peculiarities of media literacy.
Fantastic. I think it's great. I think next to you is a question. Okay.
Hi, Eric Hallowell, United States. I wanted to just two things. First, on the point you made about basic safety training and conflict zones and that. I've got a master's in conflict management, and we had to take a humanitarian training course, which I'd highly recommend. And I wondered, was there anything actually standardized for journalists in that? Because there are things like basic safety, but also not being used as agents of propaganda for governments, taking photos, you know, things like that. Yeah. Or is that something that's needed?
That probably could be part of something, but not the hostile environment training. The hostile environment was very specifically, you know, how to jump out of a car if you're taken prisoner. Okay. There's a lot of first aid and that kind of thing. But no, I think every news organization should have those kinds of training courses for their own new journalist hires. Yeah.
Okay. And then just to follow up to some of the technology questions, because I'm also a software developer and trying to mix the humanities with software development. I do think it's getting better with, I know Twitter is deleting 70 million, you know, fake accounts. The answer is fighting software with software ultimately. So some of the things that you'd mentioned, like verification checks, URLs, IP address checking, you know, looking at images, basically looking at strange variances, that can be done a lot faster. There's just not enough verification people to be able to keep up. So some of that needs to be automated. And then
the problem is, though, as soon as you can come up with a way to check something, the guys creating the fake content can figure out ways around it.
Speed against speed, though, too. I mean, with cloud computing and artificial intelligence techniques, we need the good guys fighting the bad guys, too. And also a model that, you know, I know I was at the U.S. Peace Institute a few months back. They have a peace tech lab there, and they're working on a global truth platform that's trying to pull together aggregating sources, like looking at a map of an area, you hear a news source come out, what is the confirming information about that, both from social media, respected sources. I mean, we have like verification on selling a seller on eBay and Amazon, but we don't really have kind of a truth index, if you will, on individuals. And I think more of that's there. I don't know if that's the ultimate platform, but those kind of platforms potentially, you know, are an aid.
Those are important. I know. And things, you know, there are things that we can do, like on Facebook, you can give verification, not verification, but you can give kind of a higher mark or a higher position on a Facebook page to something that comes from a more reputable source like Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, than if there's a website that was created yesterday in Russia. You know, you may give that a lower space on the Facebook feed. So there are things that you can do right away. Let's take a couple more. One up here.
Which three of the main issues, post-conflict issues, is waiting for Ukrainian media?
But which one the most?
Which three the main post-conflict issues?
The most, but the post-conflict
waiting for Ukrainian media.
Post-conflict for the Ukrainian media, I think, you know, making sure you gather and document after the conflict is over. Make sure you can get into there right away, into the East, and document as much as you can about what happened. Often I found that when you go into an area like I went into Afghanistan right after the Taliban left. I went into southern Iraq right after Saddam Hussein's troop left. You get in there right away and start talking to people right away. Document as much as you can. Write down people telling you what happened, because that's going to be key to get those stories out. Secondly, if there's some kind of a ceasefire, the journalists can help as an early warning system. If you see people violating that ceasefire, let that be known right away as soon as possible, because the journalists can possibly, again, I don't know the details of all the situation here, but the journalists can help maybe bring sides together or bring people talking together by going and talking to people on both sides. Are there ethnic Russians over there who feel one way? And can you talk to Ukrainians here? Can your media provide kind of a platform for all sorts of views out there? They'll try to be a force for bringing people together, because too often I don't know about this conflict, but in the world, too often the world media is driving people apart, especially when you have media in their own ethnic corners or their own religious corners or their own geographic corners. Media could do a good job of trying to bring more people together and try to explain both sides or all sides of conflict. Those are just some examples. I mean, I don't know the specifics of the situation here too much, but we take one more. Is there anybody want to do one last one? Or did I talk you all out? We got the pink in the back.
I worked as a graphic designer, and I lived in Paris 10 years ago. I have a question. When I lived in Paris, I noticed that all the streets and media are full of pictures of children of Africa and representations of poverty and hardships which experience people in Africa. And as a graphic designer, I understand that the journalists are trying to create a certain image of life in Africa. But this is not real life in Africa. This is just an image. So there can be found another journalist who would like to create another image of life in Africa. They can point on positive sides of life in Africa, such as living close to nature. People in Africa don't need to spend their lifetime at office, and so on. So you said that the aim of profession of a journalist to tell the truth. But the journalists are not free. They need to produce content in frame of commonly accepted concepts.
Well, that's somewhat true. I mean, journalists should not try to just, feed into stereotypes.
So do you feel a kind of pressure because you are employed? And if you would represent the people from Africa as happy people, as those who live close to nature, as those who don't watch TV series all the days, and so on, your point of view will not be accepted and you will be fired.
Oh, I don't think that would happen necessarily. I guess it depends on what news organization you're talking about. But, the problem is when, all countries, and especially Africa's a continent, and it's huge. And there are people who are happy and watching television, and there are people who are doing internet startups, and they have stock markets, and they have all kinds. But there are also places that are at war. So you can find almost anything you want, if you're looking for it in almost any country. You have most of the countries there have big cities where people are doing fine. They have rural areas where people are poor. So, often it's a matter when you're a journalist of choosing, what you're going to focus on. I would agree with you that a lot of the news that comes out of Africa tends to focus on the poverty or the conflicts. We don't do a good job. I probably didn't do a good enough job when I was there of writing about the economies that were doing well, or the businesses that were doing well in Africa. Africa's economies now is one of the fastest growing in the world for most of the countries there, if you leave out the ones that are in conflict. Stock markets are booming in West Africa these days. So, the Chinese investment there has made Africa really growing rapidly now. So Africa's an incredibly huge and complex place, and I think we tend to just focus on conflict.
But you are employed, and do you have a kind of brief how to show the life in Africa? Because at advertising agency we have a kind of brief, so we need to represent a a family as a happy family, because customers do not like families which are not smiling. People are smiling. Families are happy. Kids are beautiful, and so on. The same situation probably with these pics about Africa, because people are unhappy, kids are poor, and so on. So this is, to me, as a graphic designer, it's very similar task which is offered by employees to journalists, and journalists, they just work on demand.
Well, most
so
journalists
they just complete a certain task.
Well, most journalists I know based in Africa are trying to tell a complete story of what's going on in Africa. And as I said, it's every country is complex, and they have people who are happy and people who are not happy. So, I mean, every journalist I know is trying to do a good job based in Africa about covering the story, and they're not trying to feed into the stereotypes. I think there are too many stereotypes going on now. I mean, there's a stereotype about, sometimes when they depict Africa, it's always about animals. If it's East Africa, it's all about giraffes and elephants and all that. But, you go to Nairobi, and I've never seen a giraffe except in a giraffe farm. So, so I mean, journalists need to do a good job of breaking away from those stereotypes, and they're always stereotypes. I mean, there's this, I worked for an American newspaper, so the stereotype was that the French all sit around in cafes all day and go on strike. The stereotype is that, the Germans, Germans are all efficient. The stereotype, Canadians are all really nice and all quiet, and, Russians drink too much vodka. We all have these stereotypes, but I think the job of the journalist is to try to break through these stereotypes and really present countries in all their complexity.
But do you have a kind of director who can reject your materials?
I'm a teacher now. I teach journalism, so I am the boss.
I mean, when you were employed at newspapers.
No, there's nobody who would do that. Nobody's going to fire you for for reporting on a stereotype. Okay. Well, look, everybody, this has been a terrific. I think we're going to close it off now. Yeah, I've been given the high sign here, but look, this has been a terrific audience. I did not have to once use my translator headphones. That means America House has done such an amazing job here that they've taught everybody here English. So but again, I want to thank the U.S. Embassy for setting this all up, the speakers program. I want to thank America House for letting me do this. And most of all, I want to thank you guys for being a terrific audience and you asking really, really great questions. So thank you very much. And I'd love to come back here again sometime if you invite me.
And on behalf of America House, I would really love to thank you for this wonderful public talk and for Facebook chat with us today and for this wonderful days in Ukraine, in Kharkiv. And we're looking forward to see you more here at America House. Thank you so much. Let's applaud our speaker.